Hello and welcome to another episode of Cancelled Games. After looking at some of the Marvel games that never made it, it's only fair to cover some based on DC Comics. There have been numerous games featuring DC heroes over the years, and let's be honest, most of the decent ones have been Batman games. My personal favourites are Batman on the Amiga, Way Forward's Batman the Brave and the Bold on the Wii, and Superman 64. Haha, just kidding. That's enough about the DC games that were released, but let's have a look at 12 that weren't. We'll kick off with the first of several games featuring our old Kryptonian mate Superman, with Superman Blue Steel. This was being developed by Factor 5, most famous for the Turrican series, and for several Star Wars games in the late 90s and early 2000s. This would be published by Brash Entertainment for the PlayStation 3, Xbox 360 and Nintendo Wii. Initially this was a planned tie-in with a sequel to the 2006 film Superman Returns, which, come to think of it, I've never seen. An open world game, it would feature a good number of villains from that universe, including two that would appear in the film, Darkseid and Brainiac. When the sequel to Superman Returns was cancelled, leaving a 7-year gap until Superman returned to the silver screen in 2013's Man of Steel, the game was rehashed into a more non-specific Superman game based on all things Superman, which obviously opened things up for them creatively given Superman's deep pool of source material. It would remain an open world game set in Metropolis and would feature an online multiplayer mode which would introduce many other characters to the mix, including Supergirl. Most of the test footage is very bare bones, but there were some nice set pieces which showed that Superman would have been able to fight in mid-air and smash enemies through buildings, which does look pretty cool. The game's publisher Brash Entertainment ran into some financial difficulties and ended up going under in 2008. Factor 5 plodded on in the hope of finding a new publisher for Blue Steel, but sadly failed to do so. They too ended up closing their doors by the end of that year. Lobo was due for release in late 1996 for the Mega Drive and Super Nintendo and was based on the DC comic of the same name, starring Lobo, an interstellar mercenary and bounty hunter. Lobo first appeared in the 80s as a villain, but re-emerged in the 90s after a long hiatus as a sort of satirical play on Marvel's gritty anti-hero characters like Wolverine and the Punisher, quickly becoming a fan favourite, much to the surprise of Lobo's co-creator Keith Giffen. A versus fighter developed by Ocean, Lobo used pre-rendered graphics much like Mortal Kombat or Killer Instinct. A playable prototype was found which features 6 playable characters and their relative stages. This footage is from the cancelled Super Nintendo version. The game had some reasonable press coverage before it was cancelled, with Nintendo Power giving some insight into some of the characters. As well as Lobo, it would feature at least 5 other characters, including Kringle, a murderous take on Santa, Showler, a thief and assassin, and Lou, named after a toilet. The magazine also depicts each's special moves, with each character having 4, except for Lobo himself with 5. We can see from the corresponding command inputs that the movesets would combine the signature quarter circle style moves of Street Fighter and the direction punch style moves of games like Mortal Kombat. It would also incorporate finishing moves with these, much like Killer Instinct did. The finishing moves only feature in the Mega Drive prototype, but it's unknown whether this would have been added had the Super Nintendo version been finished, or whether it was unique to the Mega Drive's version. One huge drawback of Lobo was that, if playing the single player story mode, you could only play as Lobo. To play as the other characters, you had to select either Versus mode or the Practice mode. Lobo was cancelled by Ocean before release, although there doesn't seem to be any concrete evidence why. The first of several Batman games on this list, Gotham by Gaslight is in my opinion the most exciting. An early prototype was created by Day One Studios, who ported Fear to the PS3 and 360 and went on to develop World of Tanks, albeit under a different moniker. Gotham by Gaslight would be based on the short comic series of the same name, first released in 1989. This became the first of DC's Elseworlds storylines, Elseworlds being a series of spin-offs set in alternate universes or timelines, much like Marvel's What If series that was mentioned in my previous episode. Set in 1889, 100 years before its publication, the story was set across Europe and England, with Batman meeting some notable characters like Sigmund Freud. It has a very Victorian feel to it visually, which is unsurprising considering it's set in 1889, and this is strengthened by the fact that the main antagonist is Jack the Ripper. An animated film was released in 2018, which was loosely based on 1989's Gotham by Gaslight and its 1991 sequel, Batman Master of the Future, set 3 years later. Now, the prototype footage of the game is so early that it only really shows Batman mooching around the city streets, but it does look promising even in this state. The streets look very authentically Victorian, and the use of darkness and light looks interesting. The lack of artificial light in 1889 seems perfectly suited to a Batman game or a stealth game in general, an aspect of the game's atmosphere that was amplified by the misty streets. And the animation on the cape, ooh, doesn't that look nice? This prototype was developed at some point around 2009-2010 by Day One Studios after THQ asked them to create a concept based around the Gotham by Gaslight comic. It was created in about 4 weeks, and it was merely a proof of concept to give the gist of the atmosphere and setting, containing no combat whatsoever. It was pitched as a PS3 and 360 game, but never passed beyond this stage before being cancelled. Reportedly, the development team were in love with the idea even at this early stage and were gutted to see the project get cancelled. Sadly, we only have some very poor screenshots from a French magazine for the planned Green Lantern game for the Super Nintendo, planned for a 1994 release from Ocean. This would have been a side-scrolling action platformer which saw Green Lantern taking on an evil alien queen who intends to take over the entire universe using some crystals imbued with great power, kinda like a discount Thanos. The game would have had 7 levels in all, although the majority were platforming. The 7th and final level would have been a flying shoot 'em up stage which would employ the Super Nintendo's Mode 7 capabilities. It seems that Green Lantern has some significant developmental struggles, with team members being replaced. Even when it was entirely finished, DC requested several changes. Ocean saw these changes as just too difficult to implement cost effectively, so decided it would be better to scrap the project. Superman's second appearance on the list is the so-called Superman 64 for the original PlayStation. This would have been a new version of Superman 64 on the N64 from Titus, but presumably that was merely a working title. This was developed by Blue Sky Software. Obviously the N64 original is regarded as one of the worst games ever, but it did actually sell reasonably well, so Titus planned to redesign the game for the PlayStation. It would be more of a linear third-person action game incorporating Superman's abilities. Superman's powers could be toggled by pressing triangle, super speed, heat vision and icy breath, and he can also fly, obviously. These powers could be used against enemies, but would also be employed to solve puzzles and pass through barriers. Accidentally killing a civilian with these powers would result in an instant fail, restarting the level. Several objects imbued with kryptonite, including bullets, would temporarily remove Superman's powers, essentially reducing him to a mere mortal with only the ability to walk and punch very weakly, and giving him a health bar which made him extremely vulnerable to attack. It doesn't seem like we missed much with this cancellation, but the game has been praised for its level design, and it's certainly an improvement over the terrible N64 game. There are no bloody rings to fly through for one. Despite several rumours that the game was completely finished, with even a handful of copies being owned by collectors, the development team have stated that it was in fact 75% complete before it was cancelled. Titus lost the Superman rights before it could be finished, so it was cancelled seemingly against their will. This prototype footage is from PlayStation Museum, but you can find full playthroughs on YouTube if you want to see more. Superman didn't always ride solo. He's resurfacing yet again in this one, but this time joined by Batman and chums in Justice League, being developed by Double Helix Games for the PS3, 360 and Wii. This was being developed in 2008 with the working title Justice League Arcade, a planned tie-in with a Justice League film from Mad Max director George Miller called Justice League Mortal, which itself was cancelled. This was a 3D arena brawler and would allow players to take control of 2 characters from a pool of 16 DC heroes and villains. These included Justice League members Batman, Wonder Woman, Superman, The Flash and Green Lantern, and some notable bad guys too like General Zod, Bane, Sinestro and Cyborg Superman. The game would feature a versus mode and a story mode in which only the 5 Justice League characters were playable, but both modes had the same gameplay. Players beat up a set number of opponents in a themed arena with destructible environments and could tag each of the 2 characters in and out. This allowed for tag combo moves, but also let one character use his or her abilities on their partner. For example, Green Lantern could protect his teammate with a shield. It's safe to say that this is one of the best looking games on this list. The beat 'em up gameplay makes excellent use of each hero's abilities, has large highly detailed environments, gorgeous graphics and most importantly looks pretty damn fun. Some of the unique abilities look really fun to use and were great ideas gameplay wise, like Wonder Woman's lasso and Flash's ability to slow time by running. The story mode let players earn experience points which would in turn be spent to unlock new characters or upgrade the 5 characters available in the story mode. These upgrades included boosts to attributes such as health, damage and increasingly powerful special moves, and could even unlock entirely new, super powerful moves. Versus mode featured 19 arenas of considerable size which were themed on their respective characters very well. The playable character also had various skins. Rather than just a straight palette swap, they were based on different iterations of that character over the years. For example, you could switch to Batman's Adam West era outfit. The film Justice League Mortal ran into several issues before production even started, which resulted in the project being scrapped in 2009. Double Helix worked on this for over a year, having poured a considerable amount of money and effort into the development of the game, particularly its combat engine. They pushed to have this released as a standalone Justice League title. This obviously didn't happen, but they did reuse many of its assets in their 2011 game Green Lantern Rise of the Manhunters, which was released in conjunction with the poorly received Green Lantern film. So not a total loss, but I can't help but feel that we missed out on a real treat with Justice League Arcade, or whatever it would have ended up being called. Sometime in the early 90s, Software Creations were developing a Batman game for the Super Nintendo. A side-scrolling beat-em-up, it's like a poor man's Batman Returns. They were no stranger to developing licensed games, nor comic book hero games, having made 3 Spider-Man games for the Super Nintendo and Mega Drive. As I said, this does have similarities to 1993's Batman Returns, published on the Super Nintendo by Konami, but it's clearly inferior. I'm not entirely sure when this was being developed exactly, so it's possible that Konami released Batman Returns and they realised that it was too similar, or that it just couldn't compete. Or maybe it just wasn't good enough in general. The reasons behind its cancellation are unknown. In 2008, a cart containing a prototype popped up for sale on eBay, although the ROM has been around for a lot longer online, so you can easily find a download if you want to try it. I wouldn't recommend bothering, as it's pretty naff, and is a very early build without any sound. The Flash would have had his very own open world game for the Xbox 360, PS3 and Wii, being developed in the late 2000s by Bottle Rocket Entertainment. Brash Entertainment approached Bottle Rocket to develop a game based on the DC hero after they acquired several DC licenses from Warner Bros. The Flash would have featured an original story from veteran writer Marv Wolfman, who had written numerous comic book adaptations for TV and games. The gameplay was open world, striving for a Grand Theft Auto vibe blended with superheroes. It actually really reminds me of Saints Row 4, which lets you use various superpowers, including running at super speed like the Flash. Despite open world games being no new thing at the time, they still had to develop an engine from the ground up, purely to deal with the visuals when the Flash was running at speed. Because Brash had the license to use several DC characters, there would have been several cameo appearances in the game, and a Flash vs Superman race was even discussed. The prototype gameplay primarily demonstrates this, and also indicates that there would have been an emphasis on beat-em-up combat. Ironically, Brash Entertainment proved to be rather brash financially and ended up going bankrupt, so the Flash was cancelled. Bottle Rocket struggled on for a brief time, but they too closed down not long after in 2009. Swamp Thing was in development from Microsmiths and was to be published by New Vision for the Sega Mega Drive. Based on the DC comics of the same name, Swamp Thing was a side-scrolling platformer in which the player controls Swamp Thing on a mission to protect the forest from various enemies. The prototype, released by Sega Age in 2010, features only the first level, but shows roughly how the game would have played. Swamp Thing can walk or swim around the levels and can hit enemies, but can also take on the form of various inanimate forest objects such as logs and leaves. Some uninspiring graphics and reportedly terrible controls make this one game that's probably left on the discard pile. Batman: The Dark Knight was an open-world stealth action game being developed by Pandemic Studios, who developed the original Star Wars Battlefront games. Announced in 2007, although informally, it never received an official announcement. It was to be a tie-in with the upcoming 2008 film The Dark Knight, coming to the PS3 and Xbox 360. However, Pandemic were originally making a more general Batman game for EA, before EA decided that it needed to be based, albeit loosely, on The Dark Knight. Unfortunately, this meant that they had to scrap a lot of the work they'd already done since late 2006. To add insult to injury, EA wanted the game released before the end of 2008 as the license was due to expire. Because of this, Pandemic used the engine created for their 2009 game The Saboteur, which was in development at the time, and incidentally I thoroughly enjoyed. Once it was decided that this would be based on The Dark Knight, Pandemic were given access to the film's script and some of its assets, and many of the original cast would be voicing their respective roles in the game. The original more linear concept for the game was changed to an open world action game with an emphasis on stealth, and this would have been the first open world game to feature the Caped Crusader. The use of the Saboteur's engine caused too many problems for Pandemic, not the least of which would be that it would slow to snail's pace or even crash entirely when the Batman assets were introduced. In the end, they couldn't fix all these issues within the allotted development window, which was very short. EA reportedly lost a lot of money from not capitalising on this expensive Warner Bros. License, and The Dark Knight became the only Batman film never to receive a video game adaptation. I read a synopsis of Gen 13's plot and it made no bloody sense to me, but hey, who cares, so I'm just going to gloss over that. It's based on the comic book series of the same name, starring a team of superpowered teenagers. This original PlayStation game was being developed by Grey Matter and would be published by EA. It was an interesting mix of genres, including side-scrolling shooter / beat-em-up levels, as well as an arena mode which was a versus fighter. Gen 13 would be played 1 or 2 player, controlling any of the 5 playable characters, and featured quote team up levels in which the computer AI controls any other non-player allied characters. It's played primarily as a 2D side-scrolling beat-em up, but it has 3D environments and characters. As I said, this is a bit of a mixed bag, and seemingly the engine was designed to allow for a wide range of camera angles, sequences and gameplay styles. Sadly, due to some kind of disagreement between Grey Matter and EA, the studio closed, and all games in development were cancelled, including Gen 13. In 2003, DC made a deal with Acclaim to develop a game based on the noir comic series 100 Bullets, which questioned whether people would be willing to exact revenge on those who had wronged them if given the chance. These standalone stories of revenge eventually converged and crossed over into a more complex criminal plot. It was headed to the PS2 and Xbox in late 2004. The creators of 100 Bullets would have been involved with the game's direction and art style, and it would have had an original storyline written for it. There would be 2 playable characters, one from the original source material and one brand new character unique to the game. Gameplay was very much a third-person shooter, reminiscent of popular titles of the generation like Max Payne and Enter the Matrix. The player has access to an array of firearms, and levels would have destructible environments. The player could also use enemies as human shields. But Acclaim were keen to dissuade players from going all guns blazing by implementing consequences to their moral choices in-game. A prototype was shown at E3 in 2004 and critical reception was reasonably positive. Sadly, 100 Bullets was cancelled when Acclaim ran into financial difficulties and closed down, but the comic's co-writer Brian Azzarello stated that he was hopeful that it would eventually receive a video game adaptation. It certainly seems perfect for one. So that was 12 of the cancelled games based on DC Comics. Let me know in the comments which ones you think look decent and which are best left on the discard pile. Or let me know what your favourite DC franchise games are in general. I'll see you soon for another episode of Cancelled Games, and as always, thanks for watching. You can find the other episodes in my Cancelled Games series in this playlist.